This is Faith Still Seeking, a program about Christian theology. I believe, but I want to know more. I'm not a minister. I'm not a PhD. I'm just a layman, and I'm doing theology. Yeah, I definitely don't have it all figured out, but it's never stopped me from trying.
What the fuck am I doing here? Guess I'm looking for a place to be. I don't know what the hell to believe. I wish I had the answers up my sleeve.
Hi, and welcome to another episode of Faith Still Seeking. My name is Kelly. I'm a writer and podcaster and aspiring theologian, lay theologian, student of theology. I've spent a lot of time studying theology, both in college and graduate school, and also on my own. The things I'm trying to uncover are some of the popularly accepted truths about Christianity and whether they are really supported by the Bible, by Christian tradition, by the church, by history, by the major figures who've defined Christianity throughout the centuries, or if some of them are just picked up from popular media or from just kind of a casual acquaintance with Christianity through just going to church on Sundays and, hearing a sermon here and there. And these first several episodes are kind of laying the groundwork for letting you, the listener, know where I'm coming from, what my approach is, what my biases are, but also what my assumptions are, what techniques I'm using, etc. This episode is about my approach and really the question of whether one can approach religious truth, particularly Christian truth, in a somewhat scientific way. So an expert that I frequently turn to is Alistair McGrath, who is a professor of science and religion at the University of Oxford and who's written just so many books on theology. I don't know when he gets time to teach because he must spend all of his time writing. And he's pretty fair and balanced in talking about the range of different Christian ideas. He gives a very good historical and philosophical overview. I pulled some quotes from the book that's simply titled Christian Theology, An Introduction. This is the 6th edition. This is from a subsection called The Historical Development of the Idea of Theology. The word theology is easily broken down into two Greek words, theos, and I'm sure in the original Greek it is pronounced differently than that, but theos, which is God, and logos, which is word. And if you study the Bible, you know that logos takes on a much bigger meaning, particularly when we get to the Gospel of John. But in this case, it really does mean just discussion or discourse. So as McGrath says, theology is thus discourse about God in much the same way as biology is discourse about life. The Greek bios, meaning life. If there is only one God, and if that God happens to be the God of the Christians, to borrow a phrase from 3rd century writer Tertullian, then the nature and scope of theology are relatively well defined. Theology is reflection upon the God whom Christians worship and adore. Now, I am not making the argument today about how many gods there are, but I am confining my exploration for this series, at least, to Christian theology. What McGrath said here is pretty close to my purpose, my intention, which is to reflect on the God of the Christians, what that God wants, and what it means to be of service to that God. And in doing, I want to know what Christianity says about that God, not just the Bible, not just the church, but as an entire entity, Christianity, Christendom, which is the result of 2,000 years of development and flourishing. I would like to approach this as sort of a scientist. Before I started reading these definitions, that's what I thought theology was the science of God. When I studied biology, it was the study of life or the science of life. So when I think of theology, I think of like God science. But discussion about God or discourse about God also makes sense in large part because the nature of most of the evidence that we have about God is in words. I'm a writer. I deal with words every day, and I work also in advertising. So I know I can argue anything in words. It's hard to conduct a scientific experiment about God that is like going outside and scooping up a handful of dirt and finding out what minerals it's made of, or mixing up something in the lab that you can taste and see if it's sweet, or that you can mix it with something else and see if it blows up, or whatever. That a lot of it is kind of thought experiments and listening to arguments and letting them wash over and see if they feel true. So there's historically been a struggle between the discipline of science and the discipline of theology. But I still believe that the principles of science can be used to try to get at least as close to the real as possible. Speaking of the relationship between science, pure science, and theology, there's a concept that I became aware of in the 90s. It may have predated that, but it's the idea of what's abbreviated as NOMA, N-O-M-A, or non-overlapping magisteria. One proponent of this idea was the paleontologist Steven Jay Gould. He actually wrote an essay in 1997 with that title, and it was somewhat in response to an address that Pope John Paul II had given the previous year. In 1996, Pope John Paul gave a speech to the Pontifical Academy of Sciences, and it was entitled "Truth Cannot Contradict Truth." Apparently, the topic of the meeting was the origins of life and evolution, which is something that the Catholic Church, Christian people have struggled with since the idea of evolution emerged. The Pope said, "New knowledge has led to the recognition of the theory of evolution as more than a hypothesis," which, if you look at the history of the church and science, was really quite groundbreaking. In this same speech, the Pope said, "Since revelation, for its part, contains teaching concerning the nature and origins of man, how do the conclusions reached by the various scientific disciplines coincide with those contained in the message of revelation? And if, at first sight, there are apparent contradictions, in what direction do we look for their solution?" So he is recognizing at least that the theory of evolution is competing with some of the theories of creation as historically taught in the Bible, and is pushing for the recognition that we still need to think about soul and salvation and reconcile that with these notions of what evolution brings up. And in the rest of the speech, I mean, it sounds like he's being really progressive here. He does poke a few holes in the theory of evolution, even as he kind of proposes some reasons to support it as well. My understanding, I guess, is that everybody hated this speech that the Pope gave, that from the view of traditional Catholics, like he had blown it, he had totally given in to these scientific lunatics. And from the point of view of the science community, that he had given lip service to evolution, but then cast doubt on it at the same time. In response to this, I guess Steven Jay Gould was trying to help smooth things over in the scientific community and the religious community, but that he maintained that these two different magisteria, and what magisteria is, it's a term that the Catholic Church uses for itself to establish itself as an authority, a teaching authority on something. And Gould maintained that one magisterium was about facts, that was the science, and the other was about values. So it's kind of like one is about the physical world and how it works and everything, and the other one is about how you behave, the moral world, which some Christians would already say, wait a minute, no, Christianity is not just about morals. It's not just about being good. It's about the true reality of the universe. And this kind of perspective is one that you might expect from somebody who's not particularly religious themselves. So they think like, oh, religion is just like, it's about morality, and science, that's about facts. And in his opinion, these two domains, science and religion, don't overlap. And the baseline assumptions and the baseline way of doing things and gathering knowledge in both these areas were so different that there wasn't a crossover. So why should they compete? Gould wrote a book called it's called Rocks of Ages, Science and Religion in the Fullness of Life. He explains that science tries to document the factual character of the natural world and to develop theories that coordinate and explain these facts. Religion, on the other hand, operates in the equally important but utterly different realm of human purposes, meanings, and values, subjects that the factual domain of science might illuminate but can never resolve. As you might imagine, there was pushback to the idea of NOMA. So Richard Dawkins, the writer and thinker and atheist, part of the new atheists, as they were called, wrote an essay the next year in 1998 called When Religion Steps on Science's Turf. And he said, "It is completely unrealistic to claim, as Gould and many others do, that religion keeps itself away from science's turf, restricting itself to morals and values. A universe with a supernatural presence would be a fundamentally and qualitatively different kind of universe from one without. The difference is inescapably a scientific difference. Religions make existence claims, and this means scientific claims." And this is one of those rare instances where I agree with Dawkins. In this case, I'm in that camp of saying that religion is not just moral, but that it does also make essential claims about the nature of reality and creation and the world and the universe. In that same vein, Sam Harris, who's another member of the Atheist Club, argues that morals are not off limits for science. He wrote a book called The Moral Landscape, in which he says, "Meaning, values, morality, and the good life must relate to facts about the well-being of conscious creatures, and in our case, must lawfully depend upon events in the world and upon states of the human brain." So for him, these are interconnected, maybe even dependent upon one another, and certainly not independent, non-overlapping areas of study. So there are arguments for and against considering theology to be scientific in nature. However, coming back to McGrath, he quotes 20th century Catholic theologian Karl Rahner in saying, "Theology is the science of faith. It is the conscious and methodical explanation and explication of the divine revelation received and grasped in faith." And what I like here is the consciousness part of it, the fact that it's methodical, that there's a discipline to it, and that it seeks to explain the basics of this otherwise kind of hard to hold, slippery revelation. I say all that to say that even if I do try to approach theology using some scientific methodology, I do not believe that the Bible is a science textbook, nor do I believe that it needs to be in order to still be true in doing what it is designed to do. You know, what I mean by that is that the truths that the Bible is trying to communicate, and even then, I mean, the Bible is a bunch of different books, so different writers are trying to communicate different things. I do not believe that the things that they're trying to communicate are all scientifically accurate, nor do I believe that they need to be. So not every claim about the natural world that can be examined through evidence using our God-given senses is actually how things work. The world is not built on pillars. The sky is not a dome with stars hung on it. I'm sure there are claims in the Bible that are scientifically true. That in Job 26:7, it says, and this is talking about God, it says, "He hangeth the earth on nothing," which I guess, Job is considered one of the earliest written books of the Bible. That at that time, the idea of the earth being in space, surrounded by nothingness was somewhat revolutionary, as opposed to the world being on the back of a turtle or a god, or, like I said, on pillars or what have you. So this is scientifically accurate. Likewise, if you look at the prophet Amos in Amos 9:6, which is written almost 3,000 years ago, it says, he calls for the waters of the sea and pours them out on the face of the earth. And this is in the midst of a section that talks about the mist and how the mist goes up into the clouds and comes back down. And what he's doing, he's describing the water cycle, the same thing that we learned in science class in middle school. This is scientifically correct. One of the reasons that I don't look to the Bible for these kind of scientific claims is that there are some claims that are scientifically inaccurate, or at least questionable. The church and Galileo clashed over whether the sun was the center of the solar system or the earth was the center and the sun moved around the earth the way that the Bible said that it did. The church has only in the last few decades apologized posthumously to Galileo. This going back to John Paul II in 1992, he said, the theologians who condemned Galileo did not recognize the formal distinction between the Bible and its interpretation. So he's saying, when you're reading the Bible, you got to remember to interpret it correctly. Is what I'm reading communicating spiritual truth, or is it supposed to be communicating scientific truth? And if it's scientific truth, is it enough for us to exile somebody or banish them or put them under house arrest for the rest of their lives because they're a heretic? In the 1996 speech that I was talking about earlier with John Paul, where he was talking to the Pontifical Academy of Sciences, he said, talking about Galileo, he said, I need to draw attention to the need for a rigorous hermeneutic for the correct interpretation of the inspired word. It is necessary to determine the proper sense of Scripture while avoiding any unwarranted interpretations that may make it say what it does not intend to say. In order to delineate the field of their own study, the exegete and the theologian must keep informed about the results achieved by the natural sciences. So, he's saying, one, hermeneutics is the study and interpretation of the Bible. Exegesis is looking at Scripture and unpacking its meaning. That whoever's doing this needs to also pay attention to the natural sciences and things for which there is evidence that's been confirmed by our natural God-given senses, and realize where they depart. It may be the thing that we're reading in the Bible is intended to communicate a spiritual truth, or is influenced by the understanding of things at the time and not essential to faith. Maybe it's not essential to faith that the world is only 6,000 years old, or that a flood covered the entire planet instead of just it being a really big deal in a certain section of the Middle East where all the writers of the Bible lived. And continuing to talk about the notion of how many days it took to create the heavens and the earth, particularly those first few days where there wasn't a sun to even determine the length of the day. I don't believe that those passages in Genesis are meant to communicate the exact science of it. I believe that division into 7 days, this kind of spiritually special number, is about the completeness of creation and God's control over creation in a complete way. But there are people who are actively trying to take the physical data, the scientific data, and make that story. I don't know if this is still their motto, but I remember a few years ago looking at the website for the Creation Museum, where it was said something like same data, different conclusions. So they were somehow able to draw completely different conclusions than the rest of the scientific community because they kind of knew what they wanted to achieve and were able to shape the data to fit within those constraints. In my exploration, I would definitely like to avoid that kind of variability. I would like to foster some of the repeatability and falsifiability of science. That's one of the things about science, is that it rarely settles on, okay, we've got it figured out. It's about likelihoods. The data has shown us that it's likely that this happens. And we've done repeated experiments, and they all come out showing this same thing. If you want to falsify this, if you want to prove me wrong, then do your own study and show that it doesn't work that way. And as soon as somebody does, then that theory goes away. It's a continual process, and it's a way of checks and balances of keeping the truth at the surface. To that point, one of the features of scientific thinking that I really want to employ in this process is eliminating bias. In other episodes of the show, I've already established that for me, it is highly unlikely that I'm going to be able to approach Christian teaching in anything resembling an unbiased blank slate way of looking at it. I have a whole bunch of assumptions, a whole bunch of history. In some cases, I have objections and even resentments that I'm working with, in addition to my own preconceived notions and ideas and doubts and things I want to push back on. There's also a whole clutter of thousands, maybe even millions, of different opinions and interpretations of Christian theology, with people just like me adding to them every day. If you click next on this video or on this podcast, you might get some other Yahoo that's doing the same thing that I'm doing, who may completely disagree with me. The scientific approach is a way, what they call screening out the signal from the noise. So there's a lot of static, and trying to get kind of a clearer bead on what is most likely. I'm avoiding saying like the truth, because there's always that thing that Paul said, is we're looking through a mirror darkly. We only know part of the truth, and we're continuing to get closer to it all the time. So having said that, there are two outcomes that I do not hope for. One is finding out that the results, that knowing one's knowledge of Christian truth are so individualized and subjective that no two people can know the same thing, in which case I feel like if it's that individualized, then it kind of gets into that, like, what is truth? Is there a universal truth, etc. And I also don't want to get to the point where the science and the spirituality are so in conflict that the only way to maintain belief is to blindly accept the Bible, even when it disagrees with itself or what we observe. I'll follow the evidence where it leads, but I hope it doesn't end to those two very different but equally unsatisfying dead ends. So, having said all this, what parts of the scientific approach would benefit this process? One of the principles that I want to employ is the principle of questioning everything. And the quote, question everything, this 2-word phrase, is, I looked online and it's attributed to Albert Einstein, because, if something's smart, people want to attribute it to Albert Einstein. It's kind of the nature of the internet, but it's quoted by a lot of people. It could have been anyone. Some people trace the concept all the way back to ancient Greece, to Socrates, who believed that we should question everything until we knew that our beliefs were based on a firm foundation. You can find some hint of this in 1 Thessalonians. In chapter 5, Paul says, test everything, hold fast to what is good, and abstain from every form of evil. I like that idea, like test everything. Even Paul, in his spirituality, is saying this. In the recent reboot of the series Cosmos, the TV series Cosmos, which was developed first back in the late 70s, early 80s by Carl Sagan, was rebooted with astrophysicist and general scientific media personality Neil deGrasse Tyson. They elaborate on this idea in the opening of the first program, and I really like the quote and how it unfolds. He's talking about this kind of scientific journey of exploration. He says, to make this journey, we'll need imagination, but imagination alone is not enough. because the reality of nature is far more wondrous than anything we can imagine. This adventure is made possible by generations of searchers strictly adhering to a simple set of rules. Test ideas by experiment and observation. Build on those ideas that pass the test. Reject the ones that fail. Follow the evidence wherever it leads and question everything. Now, there's probably some people who would say that this is dangerous from a faith perspective, but I, for one, believe that the truth can stand questioning and investigation in the same way that God can stand it when the psalmist is yelling at God for making them feel abandoned or abused, or just questioning, like, God, are you really there? That God can stand this scrutiny, and that our faith is stronger for having asked these questions rather than just shoving them down and ignoring them, because I think they'll find some way to come out one way or the other. So another aspect of scientific thinking that I want to employ is not to make assumptions beyond what the evidence shows. And this goes back even to what the Pope was saying about not making the scriptures say something that they don't. This is where an old joke comes in. I mean, it's kind of a joke. It's sort of a dry academic joke, but the renowned mathematician Ian Stewart, in Concepts of Modern Mathematics, tells this story. So a mathematician, a physicist, and an astronomer are riding a train through Scotland. The astronomer looks out the window, sees a black sheep in the middle of a field, and exclaims, "How interesting! All Scottish sheep are black." The physicist looks out the window and corrects the astronomer. No, some Scottish sheep are black. The mathematician looks out the window and corrects the physicist. In Scotland, there exists at least one field where one sheep is black on at least one side. So he's being very, very specific about just keeping to what the evidence tells us and nothing more. Part of not going beyond what the data supports, what the scripture supports, is not assuming that the Bible is, and this is a word that I'm borrowing from some recent posts from Bible scholar Dan McClellan, what he refers to as univocal, meaning that it has one single voice, that it's saying one single thing. As you will hear me say pretty often, the Bible is a collection of books written by different people at different times in different genres for different reasons in different contexts to achieve different ends over thousands of years. So to expect that it all has one single voice is putting a lot of weight on this text. And the Bible does sometimes say two different opposing things about the same topic. Just last night, I saw on social media, there was somebody challenging someone else, like, if you find a contradiction in the Bible, then post it here and we will use it as Bible study because I will show you that it's not a contradiction. And it just seems disingenuous because sometimes it clearly says two different things. Going back to Dan McClellan from his Instagram reels that I saw just recently, McClellan had said something about God changing God's mind, and someone responded to his post and said, "Look, here in the book of Numbers, chapter 23, the text says that God does not change his mind. It says, God is not human, that he should not lie, not a human being, that he should change his mind. Therefore, in the mind of that person who posted to McClellan's account, that meant that God never changes God's mind, because this verse says explicitly God does not change God's mind. However, if we go over and look in the book of Jonah, it says that God does change his mind. In Jonah chapter 3, verse 10, it says, when God saw what they did, how they turned from their evil ways, God changed his mind about the calamity that he had said he would bring upon them, and he did not do it. It explicitly says that God did change God's mind. So in these cases where you've got two different Bible verses that seem to be saying two different things, Dan McClellan offers a few different solutions. He says you could try to harmonize the opposing statements somehow and find a middle ground, perhaps develop some theology in which there are some certain special circumstances in which God changes God's mind and other circumstances in which God does not change God's mind, or, with a certain amount of faith that we can influence God's mind. That's what Abraham was trying to do in trying to talk God out of destroying the city of Sodom for their inhospitability, for being inhospitable. Or one can look at the opposing statements and make a choice about which statement has more authority. Of course, then one has to decide on the criteria by which one is choosing which has more authority. Is it based on the author? Is it based on the time in history? Does earlier mean better? Does later mean better? Is it which concept is mentioned more frequently and therefore outweighs those rare examples where an opposing view is presented? If one wants to make cohesive sense of the Bible, these are important conversations to have. One way to avoid going beyond what is actually there in the text is to avoid jumping around in the Bible, to use one verse in one part of the Bible to support another when they're not necessarily saying the same thing. It drives me nuts when I see a preacher doing this, where they're reading some part of the Bible and then they're like, turn with me to this other part of the Bible, which will explicate it a little bit more, because the verse that they use to support the verse that they're talking about doesn't always say the same thing. We talk about something like the eternal consequences of sin. If we're studying Paul, and Paul talks about the wages of sin, Paul says that the wages of sin is death. And this is an eternal death. This is not just my body dies and my soul floats off to somewhere. Paul, as far as I understand, is talking about annihilation. He does not talk about fire and brimstone and eternal torment, eternal consciousness. Jesus, on the other hand, does talk about hell. And I do not like that he talks about hell, but he does. I think it's important for us to know what he means when he talks about Gehenna, which is the name of an actual physical place just outside of Jerusalem that could be used metaphorically for the kind of bad life that one has if one relies on sin. But if one looks at Paul and says, hey, Paul's talking about eternal death, and what he means is, let's flip over to the gospel, that it means that he's burning in eternal hellfire like the rich man in the parable that Jesus gives. It makes it seem like Paul is talking about something that he's not. And that's one of the things that I'm trying not to do. Another example is, if we're jumping around in the Bible from place to place and different books, different people, is that if one biblical writer, say Matthew, or the community of Matthew that developed Matthew's gospel, if one biblical writer says, Jesus comes back in the clouds in glory and great power, and another writer says, he will come like a thief in the night, that's Paul. That someone trying to reconcile those two, instead of saying there's some quality to Jesus's return that's reflected in each of those, that it's quick and kind of sneaks up on you like a thief in the night, but is this glorious arrival as well, kind of like the bridegroom in the parable of the wise and foolish virgins. Like when the bridegroom shows up, it's a surprise. It's the middle of the night, but it's glorious because it's the groom and now we're all going to get married. But instead of reconciling them that way, a theologian could also look at that and say, wait, we've got a thief in the night and we've got glorious coming. Therefore, Jesus is coming back twice. Jesus is going to come back once in a really sneaky way, and then he's going to come back in this really public way at some other point. And based on what I see in Revelation, I don't see the church in Revelation in John's vision after the letters to the churches. Therefore, maybe the sneaky part happened at the beginning of that, and then I see Jesus come back in glory later in that with his armies. Therefore, we have the rapture. And this is, I think, the thought process that, what's his name, Darby, came up with in, when did Darby come up with that? Okay. So this is from Wikipedia. John Nelson Darby lived from 1800 to 1882. He was an Anglo-Irish Bible teacher, one of the influential figures among the original Plymouth Brethren. He is considered to be the father of modern dispensationalism and futurism. Pre-tribulation rapture theology was popularized extensively in the 1830s by John Nelson Darby and the Plymouth Brethren, and further popularized in the United States in the early 20th century by the wide circulation of the Scofield Reference Bible, which is another thing, which is if you are the publisher of the Bible and you put notes in that Bible that say, this is how this verse is connected to this verse, and they come together to create a third thing that is not talked about elsewhere in the Bible, that is also an interpretive sleight of hand that adds to the text. But I think that's the thinking that Darby came up with. And I don't think it's spot on. I don't think that's what was intended. When I look at these writers, Matthew was trying to make one point about the power and glory of Jesus' return. Paul was trying to make another point about the unpredictability of Jesus' return, which kind of makes sense that for a period of time after Jesus' departure, people were talking about the second coming being like next week. And then, as time went on, we started saying like, okay, maybe, hey folks, maybe you should go back to work. Maybe this is going to be a little longer wait than we think, but it's going to be unpredictable. So continue to be ready for it. And then when I read Revelation, I look at a world where, there's a concept I guess it's a scientific concept called Occam's razor, which is attributed to the Earl of Occam, William of Occam, an English friar, that William of Occam is, along with Thomas Aquinas, among the most prominent figures in the history of philosophy during the High Middle Ages. He's probably best known today for the methodological principle known as Occam's razor. And Occam's razor is often expressed as don't multiply entities beyond necessity. This is in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Okay, here I am, back at old Wikipedia. In philosophy, Occam's razor is the problem-solving principle that recommends searching for explanations constructed with the smallest possible set of elements. It is also known as the principle of parsimony. Popularly, this principle is paraphrased as the simplest explanation is usually the best one. This philosophical razor advocates that when presented with competing hypotheses about the same prediction, and both hypotheses have equal explanatory power, that one should prefer the hypothesis that requires the fewest assumptions, and that this is not meant to be a way of choosing between hypotheses that make different predictions. It's not that the simplest explanation is always the correct one, but that it typically is. And when I look at Revelation and I see that the writer, who's based in the first century during the Roman Empire, is exiled, may not be aware of the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in 70 AD. So this first century author is describing a world where a Roman Empire, and it's explicitly Roman Empire when he talks about the 7 hills, like that is Rome. So describes a Roman Empire with Jewish temple worship and battle that's fought on horses and fought with swords and spears. There are probably multiple hypotheses, but there are at least 2. One is that sometime in the future, the Roman Empire or something like it is going to return, that the temple is going to somehow be rebuilt, that a number of people in Israel are going to return to traditional temple worship in Jerusalem, that battles are going to be fought on horseback with swords and spears by one of the most technologically advanced militaries on the planet, or that this writer intended for the message to be that these things are going to happen now in the first century when the Roman Empire still exists. And as far as he knows, maybe the temple still exists and people are still fighting on horses and with spears and whatnot. So when I look at those two hypotheses, the one that's the simplest is he thought this was going to happen soon, which is in line with the gospel writers saying that Jesus said that he was going to come back in the lifetime of the people who were watching. There was this huge expectation that all this stuff was going to happen right away. None of this takes away from the message of hope that's in the book of Revelation. They're like, hey, we win, and there's going to be this river of life, and there's going to be this great reconciliation, and the world is going to be renewed, and heaven's going to come down. None of this takes away from that. But I don't, from a scientific standpoint, I don't see a reason to push all this into the future. I think it's highly unlikely that all those things are going to line back up. It's possible. I don't want to exclude possibilities. I'm talking about likelihoods, but I also don't want to read beyond what the text actually offers from a data standpoint. One of the early Christian thinkers who talks a lot about knowing and not knowing and being able to talk about Christian truth is our friend St. Augustine. This is his book, Confessions. I really like this book. I like the autobiography testimony part of it because Augustine was a very, very worldly fellow before his conversion. I can identify with that. And I also enjoy that it then goes on, once he's told his story, he then goes on into theology and starts talking about biblical interpretation and specifically gets into the book of Genesis and starts talking about how to interpret those first chapters of Genesis and creation. And he does it in a very metaphorical way. He's not looking at it like these are, 6 24-hour days. But I digress. St. Augustine tells us that it's fine to question everything we know, but it's also just as fine to admit that there are things that we don't know. In Confessions, he says, "How then shall I respond to him who asks, what was God doing before he made heaven and earth? I do not answer, as a certain one is reported to have done facetiously, shrugging off the force of the question. He was preparing hell, he said, for those who pry too deep. It is one thing to see the answer. It is another to laugh at the questioner, and for myself, I do not answer these things thus. More willingly would I have answered, I do not know what I do not know, than cause one who asked a deep question to be ridiculed, and by such tactics gain praise for a worthless answer." In another essay that Augustine wrote called The Literal Meaning of Genesis, Augustine warns that making claims about what we don't know runs the risk of giving the entire faith a bad name. He says, usually, even a non-Christian knows something about the earth, the heavens, and the other elements of this world, about the motion and orbit of the stars, and even their size and relative positions, about the predictable eclipses of the sun and moon, the cycles of the years and the seasons, about the kinds of animals, shrubs, stones, and so forth. And this knowledge he holds to as being certain from reason and experience. Now, it is a disgraceful and dangerous thing for an infidel to hear a Christian, presumably giving the meaning of Holy Scripture, talking nonsense on these topics. And we should take all means to prevent such an embarrassing situation in which people show up vast ignorance in a Christian and laugh it to scorn. The shame is not so much that an ignorant individual is derided, but that people outside the household of faith think our sacred writers held such opinions, and, to the great loss of those for whose salvation we toil, the writers of our Scripture are criticized and rejected as unlearned men. If they find a Christian mistaken in a field which they themselves know well, and hear him maintaining his foolish opinions about our books, how are they going to believe those books in matters concerning the resurrection of the dead, the hope of eternal life, and the kingdom of heaven, when they think their pages are full of falsehoods and on facts which they themselves have learnt from experience and the light of reason? Reckless and incompetent expounders of Holy Scripture bring untold trouble and sorrow on their wiser brethren when they are caught in one of their mischievous false opinions and are taken to task by those who are not bound by the authority of our sacred books. For then, to defend their utterly foolish and obviously untrue statements, they will try to call upon Holy Scripture for proof and even recite from memory many passages which they think support their position, although, and then quoting 1 Timothy 1:7, they understand neither what they say nor the things about which they make assertion. So he's saying here that people outside the faith know a lot about the world that they can observe. And if someone within the faith is making statements that are obviously opposed to what we can observe scientifically, then, and someone knows it, then why would they take our word on anything else, like our spiritual experience? So it's important. You can kind of see a through line through this whole thing, that it's important to also keep in touch with what people who are in the business of observing the natural world are observing, and not just using the word on the page to oppose what we can plainly see, because it's going to backfire. On the other hand, Augustine does offer the possibility that the truth can be known. So one of the scientific principles, if you will, that I'd like to apply to this process is working with the confidence that the truth can be known. Otherwise, what would be the point? It would be really easy to look at all of this information and all the different misinformation and conspiracy theories and weirdness in the world and just say, you know what, it's too much. There's too much information, too many contradictions, so I can't really know anything. Nothing can be known. But I think that sort of what is truth avenue that Pontius Pilate leaned on is a cop-out. While Augustine acknowledged the things that he didn't know, he also pushed back against the skeptics, and I'm talking capital S skeptics of his time, the first official movement of those who gave skepticism its name, that according to scholar Robert Nash, who wrote a biography of Augustine, Augustine's theory of knowledge begins with the conviction that there is such a thing as truth, and that it is accessible to human reason. In essence, Augustine lets us know that just because we can't know everything doesn't mean we can't know anything. Another scientific principle that I'd like to apply to this work is not cherry-picking the evidence. In short, taking the good with the bad, or that puts a value judgment on it. It's regarding the statements that I like and the statements that I don't, and giving them equal weight. I feel like there's a certain degree to which, conscious or not, that many believers emphasize some parts of the Bible more than others. And it's pretty easy to do, and I've seen it in a variety of types of churches, from what's considered conservative to what's considered liberal or progressive. For example, in my case, I could go through the Bible and only look at those passages that are about love and acceptance and embracing difference and welcoming the stranger and saving everyone and accomplishing social justice and elevating the poor and criticizing the rich and bringing empires down, that sort of thing. It would be very, very easy to do that and say, okay, now I understand what Christianity is about. I see this in online spaces that, people say, well, you Christians are nothing like Jesus because we've got Jesus all figured out. We know that Jesus is, social justice warrior, etc. At the same time, I would be ignoring all the times that Jesus talks about justice and talks about Gehenna, this idea that is translated as hell. And if I want to fully embrace Christian teaching, that means embracing the entire Bible, because the entire Bible it takes its authority from the fact that Christians used it, which was influential in how the canon of the Bible was established. It wasn't just a bunch of bishops and committee picking the Bible books that they liked the best. Is the entire communities had based their lives around these words. But I say that just to say that the most beloved central books of the New Testament, the Gospels, have Jesus saying, if you live a life of sin, that the consequences include some kind of suffering. And the word that I use for that, the image that I use for this, is this valley of Gehenna, where there was a history of child sacrifice and murders and wars, and that this is where the garbage ended up. And, and I don't like it. I don't like it when Jesus says that, but he says it. And so I need to deal with it. Now, that doesn't mean that what history has taught us about hell is correct, that it isn't necessarily the circles of hell that Dante talks about. It doesn't necessarily mean that hell is the, devil with the horns and the pitchfork and the kind of the cartoony assumptions that we make. But it is, to use the title of the book that the Christian apologist Josh McDowell uses, is it's evidence that demands a verdict. He said it. If we want to fully understand the message of Jesus, it behooves us to understand what he meant by that, not just pass it over. I grew up in a very conservative tradition where the threat of hell was over our heads all the time. So being able to dismantle that idea and think of it a little differently was a huge relief for me. But for someone else, the lack of hell also meant a lack of justice, that when they saw injustice in the world and they saw that people who did bad things didn't get punished for them in the real world. There's no such thing as karma. There's no such thing as instant retribution, or it's not like there's like a Hollywood movie where the criminal always gets theirs, that actually wicked people thrive a lot in our society, in our world, and good people suffer a lot. And the idea that there isn't some kind of divine justice on the other side, or some kind of divine punishment to reward or to pay back somebody who's done something bad. And you think about, some of the worst people that you can think of in history to get off scot-free, that there is something in the human heart that goes, wait a minute. So, so it's interesting. So that's got me thinking about ideas that are also non-biblical, but ideas like purgatory, or ideas in which there's some kind of purification ritual, like something that happens that is commensurate with the crime. I don't know if there's any crime that we commit on earth that is equal to infinite torture. Like, I would think that the first million years or two would be enough. But anyway, the book is definitely not closed on that idea. But going back to the whole cherry picking idea, someone else might come to the Bible and overlook a lot of the things that I cherish and embrace, but they might embrace ideas like patriarchy, or the value of holy war and utterly killing your enemies, and being tough on criminals, and being tough on children, and being tough on people of other faiths or no faith at all. And, hold on to the whole idea of men are the king of the household and women should stay quiet and modest, or latch on to the idea that financial prosperity is a sign that God loves us, and that every one of us deserves to be rich. And that's a way of showing the world about God's love and God's power. All that stuff is in the Bible to some degree. And when we read it, it deserves to be read in context. But in the spirit of taking the good with the bad, if a minister is teaching that wealth means God blesses us, then they should also publicly wrestle with the teachings of Jesus that say it's harder for a camel to get through the eye of a needle than it is for a rich man to get into heaven. His teaching that the young rich man who came to him and said, I have followed all your commandments, what else can I do? And Jesus says, sell everything and use it to feed the poor. And that man walked away very sad. I don't think the prosperity gospel has fully reckoned with that. I have heard the argument that the eye of the needle is the nickname for some particular passage in Israel where it's a rocky arch that the camel just has to kneel through a little to get through, and not a literal eye of the needle. And that sounds like some of the wishy-washiest cop-out stuff to me. But I'm also the one who's talking about how there's a valley outside of Jerusalem that is called the Valley of Hinnom, or Gehenna. So we all got our things that we like and the things that we don't like. We need to look at them both. Another important principle, and this takes us all the way back to the beginning of this conversation, is to be aware of one's assumptions and what one is bringing to the table that might be influencing one's conclusions. Our presuppositions, our assumptions can kind of put a thumb on the scale and tip the balance one way or the other as to what our conclusions are. Another way of thinking about this is that the person who asks the question is already influencing the results by virtue of the question that they ask.
Don't know what I'm looking for, but I'm feeling better now. Got something to avow. I'm sick of the same shit. I'm moving on now. I guess I found some kind of purpose.
And I'll give you an example that is around the creation of the universe. So if someone asks the question, how is the universe created? Then they've already made an assumption, which is that the universe has a beginning and that it, as such, it needed to be made by something, somebody. Now, a lot of people already might be saying, like, it had to have a beginning. It can't exist infinitely into the past, and everything needs a creator. But it sounds crazy, but hear me out. You've gone this far, only got a little farther to go. One of the arguments for the existence of God, which can be traced at least as far back as St. Thomas Aquinas in the Christian tradition, is the argument of universal causation. It's also known as the cosmological argument. In essence, it's the argument that everything has a cause. You know, we think about like Newtonian physics, that if something is moving, it has to have been moved by something. Something had to apply energy to the moving thing in order for it to move. And something else has to happen to that thing in order to make it stop. I mean, that's inertia. It's like objects in motion stay in motion unless acted upon by another outside force. So the argument is that everything has a cause, that every book has an author, every painting has a painter, every house has a builder, and every world has a creator. And that if one follows the causes all the way back, that one will end up at God, that there's a first cause. And even before Thomas, before Jesus, all the way back to Plato, was the idea of, at least if not a first cause, then a first mover, that all the motion in the universe came from something that like infused energy into things that made them move. Now, this is within Greek philosophy. It wasn't exactly a creation because they had the idea that the material was always there, but the motion had to start somewhere. On the surface, this seems kind of logical. You know, for my car to go, I have to start it and the engine has to move and get the wheels turning. But from a purely logical standpoint, the first cause argument is also really easy to puncture, because one simply has to say, if everything needs a creator and God created everything, then who created God? And if the answer is, well, God doesn't have a creator, then the person who's answering the questions has broken the first rule, which the first rule they established was everything has to have a creator. So they're now saying that the first thing actually violated the rule or changed the rule. And they've taken the problem of how did the universe get created, and they've just moved it one step back. Not only does this cause a logic problem by establishing a rule and then breaking the rule, but also it is a logical fallacy in that it explains the things that we can observe, namely the world and the universe and space and time, by something that we can't observe, by saying everything that we can observe is created by a God that exists outside of space and time, which is fine to believe, but we don't have the kind of empirical evidence for it that I would like to have. So it's not an airtight argument. It's a faith argument. It is, I believe this. It's not, this is absolute proof. Bertrand Russell, who's the philosopher, a mathematician, gave a talk, which was also published as an essay in 1927 called Why I Am Not a Christian. And in that, he noted this about first causes. He said, there is no reason why the world could not have come into being without a cause. Nor, on the other hand, is there any reason why it should not have always existed. There's no reason to suppose that the world had a beginning at all. The idea that things must have a beginning is really due to the poverty of our imagination. Therefore, perhaps, I need not waste any more time upon the argument about the first cause. He then goes on to argue that even if a first cause was identified, it doesn't necessarily mean that that first cause is God or God as described by Christians in the Bible. Like there's a lot of, it could have been some kind of primordial demiurge that was described by Aristotle, that was described by the early Greek philosophers, or any other creation myths. When I first read this, I found it baffling. The idea of, wait, a universe without a cause? How would that even exist? I start to think about this kind of infinite regression backwards. Somehow I don't have a problem thinking about infinity going forwards, but I have a hard time thinking about infinity going backwards. Like, how does that even exist? It almost helps for me to think about the Matthew McConaughey line from True Detective, like time is a flat circle. Like that would help, or like time is a donut. It just kind of keeps coming around and doing its thing again. I don't know if it's any of those things, but here's another quote that helped me get there. And this is from a book by a writer named David Marshall Brooks, who was a psychiatrist back in the 1930s, not the New York Times columnist David Brooks. And he wrote a book called The Necessity of Atheism, which is also the name of a book that was written 50 years or so earlier by Percy Shelley. This is not that book. So this guy, he wrote this book that was a review of current ideas in atheism in the 1930s in America, which, I guess it was a thing. So Brooks echoes what Russell said and builds on it by saying, by predicating a first cause, the theist removes the mystery a stage further back. This first cause they assume to be a cause that was not caused, and this first cause is God. Such a belief is a logical absurdity and is an example of the ancient custom of creating a mystery to explain a mystery. If everything must have a cause, then the first cause must be caused, and therefore, who made God? To say that this first cause always existed is to deny the basic assumption of this theory. If it is reasonable to assume a first cause as having always existed, why is it unreasonable to assume that the material of the universe always existed? To explain the unknown by the known is a logical procedure. To explain the known by the unknown is a form of theological lunacy. Later in the 1970s, there was a professor and libertarian activist and advocate worker with the Cato Institute and others. His name was George Smith, and he wrote a book called Atheism, The Case Against God. And I've read this book a couple times, and I believe in God. I hope that as everybody is following me through this argument, that you realize that I believe deeply in God, and I believe in God as a creator of the universe, and I believe in Jesus Christ, and he is my Lord and Savior. So I'm quoting these guys because I think that their thinking is important to wrestle with, because avoiding these possible questions, I think, is more detrimental to faith than facing them head on. And there's a lot that I learned about my faith from reading this book about atheism. Not everybody's up to that, but kind of my jam. So anyway, what George Smith says, which builds on what Russell and Brooks says, is the universe then has always existed and will always exist. Some theists find this difficult to accept, and they argue that God makes the universe easier to understand. Yet, while the theist complains of difficulty accepting the notion of an eternally existing universe, consider his alternative. We must conceive of a supernatural, unknowable, eternally existing being, and moreover, we must conceive of this being creating matter from the void of non-existence. It is strange that those who object to the idea of eternal matter display little difficulty in accepting the creation of something out of nothing. While the idea of an eternal universe may be initially difficult for some people to assimilate, the theist's alternative is an exercise in fantasy. I could do without the insult at the end, but he's making an important point here in that the laws of physics dictate that matter cannot be created or destroyed, and that energy can also not be created or destroyed. These are some of the essential laws, at least of physics as we understood them before Einstein came along in the early 1900s. But the idea that in most circumstances matter is not destroyed and energy is not destroyed, they just change forms, is consistent with the idea of a universe that always existed. As baffling as it is, as baffling as the whole mind-blowing idea of eternal regression of time backwards, that if we observe that matter isn't created or destroyed, then eternally existing material is consistent with what we've observed in the material world around us. Is the idea that the universe always existed any weirder than the idea that God always existed? That doesn't mean that I don't believe in creation, but I can't walk around with the smugness of knowing that I have a logical lock on it when there are other possibilities. And I kind of like imagining the other possibilities because it makes me think, it just makes me think in other ways about the Big Bang and what God might have been in that context. If you go back and read Genesis, it seems like there actually was stuff that when, the Spirit moved upon the face of the deep, that the deep was there. Just something to think about. But consider even the Big Bang Theory, which was first proposed actually by a Catholic priest, and which some scientists at the time thought was really a cheap argument to give creation a kind of scientific sheen. It was later when Hubble, of the telescope, and others started gathering evidence that supported the Big Bang, that the scientific community was like, oh yeah, I guess everything started in this infinitely dense, hot singularity that contained all the matter in the universe. So even if we accept the Big Bang Theory, which is supported by a fair amount of evidence, the idea that there was a singularity means that there was something that existed in the beginning. It could have been God. It could have been an infinitely dense, hot singularity. It could have been both. Maybe that singularity is God. Maybe God is infused in the whole universe. I don't know. And the idea of matter existing through all time gets less weird when I think about that singularity, because when all the matter and energy in the universe are all condensed in a singular spot, then what we know of as time and space doesn't really make sense in that context. Like nothing's moving, nothing's happening. The things that we would typically use to measure time aren't happening. I think there's a lot of possibility that there was something, even back at the beginning, before even meant anything. So why am I saying all this? Well, all of that whole long story was to say that asking the question, what caused the universe, or establishing the rule that everything has a cause, are themselves assumptions that need to be proven and may not be so. Maybe everything doesn't have a cause. Maybe, maybe. There's lots of possibilities. But the person who's asking the questions is shaping the answer already. Now, that said, it can also work the other way. That going back to George Smith, who wrote the book Atheism, A Case Against God in the 70s, that one of my main issues with this book, although, like I said, I did learn a lot about it, is that he has a really narrow definition of God. And because of that, it really made it easy for him to to make a case against that God, to the point where it was almost a straw man argument, a straw God argument, that he makes familiar arguments such as the old question of, if God is all powerful and all knowing and all good, then there should be no evil in the world. And the existence of evil means that God can't be all three of those things, that God's at least missing one of those things. And out of that, Smith then makes the leap to say, because of that, God can't exist. The fact that evil exists means that God can't exist. And I don't just mean like free will evil. I mean like, kids having cancer, or like tsunamis destroying entire communities. Those are not the result of free will, unless one believes that all of physics and medicine changed based on original sin. That's a whole different pathway. What Smith can't seem to conceive of is a God who is outside of his narrow definition of God. The way I read it is, it seems like he was raised in a very conservative Christian tradition and based his whole concept of God on that, and asking the questions that bothered him. He seems like he's knocked down God, but he's really only taken shots at one kind of God, and doesn't entertain the possibility that there's any other kind of God out there other than what he conceives of. Smith can't think of something like the God of process theology, which is pioneered by thinkers such as Whitehead, who actually was friends with Bertrand Russell. Russell said one time that he'd had a mystical experience at Whitehead's house. So anyway, history is interesting. That process theology, which is now known in some circles as open and relational theology, which is promoted by theologians such as Thomas Jay Oord, is a big proponent of open and relational theology, that God may not actually be all powerful, but actually requires human participation as part of God's co-creation, and that relationship is essential to creating the world and redeeming the world. Now, I'm only giving just like a glancing summary here. It goes much deeper than that. But there are other ways of looking at God, rather than being like, God knows everything and made everything and is all good, then why does bad stuff happen? He must not exist. Maybe there are some other reasons that don't eliminate God from the picture completely. I see echoes of this in, when I read Dawkins and Sam Harris and Christopher Hitchens, like they just stumbled upon the problem of evil, and rather than wrestling with it, they're like, hey, get out of here. And I don't doubt that they're sincere, but I just think there's more ways to look at it. But if you want the right answers, you gotta ask the right questions, and not ask questions that eliminate possibilities before we even start observation. In fact, it probably helps to start by observing and then formulate the questions based on the initial observations. Like where do those paths lead? One of the final principles of science that I want to make sure to incorporate into this work is that scientific findings are always provisional. And this is very much in line with my personal philosophy of, always doing the best that you can with what you know at the time, but also keeping an open mind to other possibilities. And one example I use for that often is the idea of the apostles, that the followers of Jesus weren't even necessarily expecting a resurrection story. They were expecting some other kind of messianic power play. If they had not been open to the idea that everything that they thought about this kind of like warrior king who was going to be the Messiah was going to turn out in a different way, that through his powerlessness or apparent powerlessness, that he was going to conquer death and the grave. If they hadn't been open to that idea, they might have missed the whole thing. So being open to revelation while also doing the best that we can with what we've got. I mean, we only know what we know at any given time. What I like about the scientific method and scientific processes is that scientific discoveries can be repeated in multiple studies. And as they gather more evidence and the same predictable results start happening more and more often, that those scientific principles start being thought of as, if not theory, then maybe even scientific laws. And then at the same time, they're falsifiable, so that if just one well-organized study comes along and shows something different, that law can be upended. And that's how, we keep ourselves honest. We keep looking at the evidence. We keep following the evidence where it leads. We keep gathering more evidence. We keep questioning everything. But we live fully into what we know, even knowing that it's provisional. It doesn't mean dancing around and being like, I can't know anything, so I can't engage in anything. No, like engage in life. Do the best you can with what you know. Just keep asking questions. And don't close your ears and eyes. Yeah, faith without works is dead. You got a belief that should change the world, then go for it. It doesn't have to be something that I agree with. If enough of us are doing it, I think it'll work out in the end. But also, I think we got to be open to the fact that things can change in a really big way, that there's a lot of assumptions that we can have that work in limited circumstances, but then in extraordinary circumstances can change. This world is really transitory, and systems that we think are permanent are not necessarily. Sometimes the most basic things that we know can be overturned. And one example is special relativity. Einstein's work on the special theory of relativity, and this is from the American Museum of Natural History. Einstein's work on the special theory of relativity prompted him to rethink the fundamental laws of physics. He realized that one of the long-held views of nature, that matter could not be created or destroyed, was wrong. Einstein showed instead that matter can be destroyed and converted to energy. Conversely, energy can be converted to mass. And the impact of that, we as a world saw not even 40 years later in the nuclear bomb. It really literally blew up what we believe to be constant about the laws of physics. Notably, in 1955, Einstein was called upon by none other than Bertrand Russell to sign what was called the Russell-Einstein Manifesto, which was a document that was signed by a number of prominent thinkers at the time to warn the world of the dangers of nuclear weapons and urged world leaders to seek peace. This isn't really part of my argument. It's just an interesting side note how these lives get interconnected. If you're wondering, Einstein was asked often about religion and is frequently misquoted about religion, which he noted even in his own lifetime. A 1930 book of profiles of different thinkers called Glimpses of the Great, the interviewer asked Einstein if he was a pantheist, which is to say, if he identified the universe with God. Pantheism is kind of this idea that the universe itself is God, and it's tied to the work of the philosopher Spinoza, Have we talked much about Spinoza here? Baruch Spinoza lived from 1632 to 1677, was a philosopher of Portuguese Jewish origin, and I believe that he was kicked out of every religious group that he could possibly have been a part of at the time. A forerunner of the Age of Enlightenment. This is, by the way, I'm reading from Wikipedia again, because I didn't want to run upstairs and get my copy of his Tractatus Theological Politicus, which I studied as an undergrad. So a forerunner of the Age of Enlightenment, Spinoza significantly influenced modern biblical criticism, 17th century rationalism, and Dutch intellectual culture, establishing himself as one of the most important and radical philosophers of the early modern period. In fact, Spinoza's philosophy spans nearly every area of philosophical discourse, including metaphysics, epistemology, political philosophy, ethics, philosophy of mind, and philosophy of science. Yeah, Spinoza's work is often seen as a real turning point in the journey toward modern thinking. So Einstein referenced Spinoza a lot, and in this book, he was asked, when Einstein had previously talked about God as being beyond our understanding, he had talked about God not being a person or personal God, like an anthropomorphic God, having admired the God of Spinoza, and also maintaining that he was not an atheist, and had said such things as, I believe in Spinoza's God, who reveals himself in the harmony of all that exists, not in a God who concerns himself with the fate and doings of mankind. Einstein also said, scientific research can reduce superstition by encouraging people to think and view things in terms of cause and effect, which is ironic because he kind of changed some of the laws of cause and effect. But certain it is that a conviction akin to religious feeling of the rationality and intelligibility of the world lies beyond all scientific work of a higher order. This firm belief, a belief bound up with a deep feeling in a superior mind that reveals itself in the world of experience, represents my conception of God. In common parlance, this may be described as pantheistic. So this now comes back around to this book, Glimpses of the Great, where he was asked if he was pantheist. Einstein said, your question is the most difficult in the world. It is not a question I can answer simply with a yes or no. I am not an atheist. I do not know if I can define myself as a pantheist. The problem involved is too vast for our limited minds. May I not reply with a parable? The human mind, no matter how highly trained, cannot grasp the universe. We are in the position of a little child, entering a huge library whose walls are covered to the ceiling with books in many different tongues. The child knows that someone must have written those books. It does not know who or how. It does not understand the languages in which they are written. The child notes a definite plan in the arrangement of the books, a mysterious order which it does not comprehend, but only dimly suspects. That, it seems to me, is the attitude of the human mind, even the greatest and most cultured, toward God. We see a universe marvelously arranged, obeying certain laws, but we understand the laws only dimly. Our limited minds cannot grasp the mysterious force that sways the constellations. I don't know if you heard this, but I hear echoes of what Paul said in 1 Corinthians 13. For we know only in part, and we prophesy only in part. But when the complete comes, the partial will come to an end. When I was a child, I spoke like a child, I thought like a child, I reasoned like a child. When I became an adult, I put an end to childish ways. For now we see only a reflection, as in a mirror, but then we will see face to face. Now I know only in part. Then I will know fully, even as I have been fully known. So here's a person who has experienced Jesus personally and still admits that he doesn't know everything. And in fact, his knowledge is only seen dimly. Okay, we've covered a lot of territory. So in the end, what am I saying? What am I doing? Why am I even here? When it comes to my theological journey, among the many different ways there are to approach theological issues, I want to be disciplined about this process. And in so doing, would like to approach Christianity with as much of a scientific acumen as I can, realizing that science and religion are not exactly the same. Some say that they don't overlap at all. I disagree. I believe that there is some overlap and that religion is not just confined to morality, but does make claims about existence. At the same time, that the Bible isn't a scientific book. That's not what it's necessarily intended to do. And also that the evidence of God is not very easy to measure the way that physical things can be measured with the five senses. However, that our faith and experience are also evidence, as well as the testimony of others and the resource of knowledge that is in Scripture and tradition, and that I can mine all of these sources for truth. And the reason that I want to approach this way is that the scientific principles can help me overcome my biases and follow the evidence where it leads, even if it's someplace I don't like, because I really want to know the truth, or at least I want to know what I think is the truth. And in the end, I know that as a human, that it's going to be provisional, that it's going to be seen dimly. I mean, between Apostle Paul and Albert Einstein, I'm not getting the promise that I'm going to get it all figured out, but that I'm going to keep doing my thing, keep doing the best I can at any given time, continue to keep an open mind to new information. So yes, I do believe provisionally that scientific acumen can be used to examine religion, specifically Christianity, and that's the approach I'm going to take. Thank you for listening to this episode, going on this journey with me, and I look forward to talking with you next time. Thank you, and God bless. Thank you for listening to this episode of Faith Still Seeking. To find out more about this program, go to faithstillseeking.com. To find out more about my work, you can find me at kellywilson.com. Our theme song, Purpose, is written and performed by musician Steve RX. You can find more of his music on Spotify, Apple Music, and other streaming platforms. Thank you for listening, and God bless.
I guess I found some kind of purpose.